All right, so today we're tackling something that I think everyone finds at least a little bit intriguing, and that's miracles.
Oh, yeah.
And as always, we're going deep. We're diving deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on miracles. We're going to try to understand how are they defined? What's the logic behind the arguments for and against them?
Right.
Are miracles truly impossible? Are they violations of natural law, or could there be another way to understand them?
Hmm.
Well, let's find out.
It's interesting how closely tied the concept of miracles is to arguments for theism. It's almost like they go hand in hand.
Yeah, it's almost like the idea of a miracle was specifically made to support the belief in God.
Yeah.
But, I mean, before we even get into arguments, how do we define a miracle?
Right.
There has to be more to it than just, something strange or unusual happening.
Right. Yeah. It can't just be something that we just don't understand yet.
Right, right.
At the simplest level, a miracle is often seen as an event that can't be explained by natural causes alone.
Okay.
But like most things in philosophy, it gets a lot more complicated. For
Yeah.
example, Aquinas argued that a miracle goes beyond what he called the productive power of nature.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that a little bit. Productive power of nature sounds very philosophical.
Sure.
What does that actually mean, in like layman's terms?
So think of it this way. Nature, including us, like humans, are capable of some pretty amazing things.
Yeah.
Birds can fly, trees grew from tiny seeds, we build these massive skyscrapers. Aquinas is saying that a miracle surpasses those natural abilities. It's something nature just couldn't do on its own, like, say, a river suddenly changing its course and flowing uphill.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
So it's not just strange or rare.
It has to be like impossible by natural standards.
Right. It has to be something that nature can't do.
Okay. Okay, so then we get Hume. And he famously defined a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. But that kind of begs the question, what are these laws of nature in this context?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. Hume's definition is very well known, but it's a lot more slippery than it seems at first. For example, we all know dead things stay dead, right?
Right?
But is that a scientific law?
Well,
Not really. Decomposition is a complex process that's governed by biology and chemistry, not some universal decree that forbids zombies.
okay. So Hume's definition is maybe a little bit wobbly then. How have other philosophers tried to, clean up this definition problem?
So Mackey, for instance, he redefined natural laws as how the world works when it's left to itself.
Okay.
It's like saying there's this natural order, and a miracle is something from outside that order coming in and messing things up.
Okay.
It kind of suggests that there's a supernatural force.
So we're drawing a line between the natural and, I guess, potentially the supernatural.
Right.
Okay. But here's where I get stuck. Imagine like a single grain of sand shifting in the desert. Technically, maybe that exceeds nature's usual power, but, does it really matter? Does that even qualify as a miracle in the way that we usually think about miracles?
That's a really good point. A miracle, especially when we're talking about it in a religious context, it needs to have significance.
Yeah.
So a random sand shift might fit a very technical definition, but it doesn't carry the weight of something like, say, someone being cured of a terminal illness.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, we understand that not all impossible events are created equal.
Right.
So how do we then define a religiously significant miracle? I mean, I'm guessing philosophers have tried to take a stab at that.
They have. So Clark, for instance, he defined it as an unusual event that's caused by God or a powerful intelligent agent for the specific purpose of proving a doctrine or someone's authority. So it's not just the event itself, but the purpose behind it that makes it a religiously significant miracle.
Okay, so we're adding intention into the mix now. It's not just that it happened, it's why it happened.
Right.
Okay. All right. So we have, I think, a better grasp on what constitutes a miracle, at least in theory.
Right.
But it's not enough to just say, well, this is a miracle.
Right.
How do people actually argue for miracles? What kind of logic are they using to support those claims?
Well, there's a bunch of different approaches, and each one comes with its own strengths and weaknesses, of course. But broadly, we can sort of group them into four categories: deductive arguments, criteriological arguments, explanatory arguments, and probabilistic arguments.
Okay, those all sound pretty technical. Can you break those down for us non-philosophy experts?
Of course.
Explain what each type of argument means, in a way that we can all understand.
Okay, so imagine a detective is solving a case, right? Deductive arguments are like having clues that lead to only one possible conclusion.
Okay.
Criteriological arguments are like setting standards for what you will accept as true. So if a claim meets certain criteria, it's more likely to be true.
So it's like setting a bar for believability.
Exactly. Then we have explanatory arguments, and they focus on finding the best explanation for the facts. You compare different theories and see which one fits best. And finally, we have probabilistic arguments. These deal with how likely something is based on the evidence.
Okay, so we're weighing the evidence and looking at the probability.
Right.
Okay, let's start with deductive arguments. I'm guessing these are all about airtight logic.
Yes, exactly. So a classic example is Paley's argument for Christian miracles. He really emphasized the testimony of the witnesses, the people who saw the miracles, and he pointed out that these were people who were so convinced by what they saw that they dedicated their lives to spreading the message, even when they were in danger, even when their lives were at stake. His point is that such unwavering belief in what they saw makes their testimony super compelling.
So the strength of the evidence, behind the miracle matters. Some miracles might have, more compelling arguments in their favor than others, but I imagine even deductive arguments have their weaknesses. What are some of the problems with this approach?
Oh, of course. Deductive arguments are very fragile. If you remove just one supporting piece of evidence, the whole thing falls apart. For instance, if we apply Paley's criteria to, say, non-Christian miracles where witnesses are equally devoted, then we run into a problem. Do we accept both sets of miracles? Or does this mean we need to rethink our criteria?
That's a good point. It sounds like this is getting more complicated than just, did it happen or not?
It is.
Okay. Let's move on to criteriological arguments then. It sounds like these are all about setting a standard for whether we should believe a miracle claim.
That's right. The philosopher Leslie, he proposed 4 criteria for believing historical claims. And they're actually pretty commonsensical. The first one is the event should be observable by the senses.
Okay.
The second, it should happen publicly. Third, there should be lasting memorials or evidence of the event. And fourth, those memorials should be established right from the time that the event supposedly occurred.
So he's trying to rule out hoaxes, right?
Yeah.
Or stories that were made up later.
Yeah.
Okay. But can any set of criteria truly guarantee that something is true? I'm a little bit skeptical.
Well, you're right to be skeptical, and in fact, Leslie himself acknowledged that those criteria don't guarantee absolute truth.
Okay.
His argument is that they make it very, very unlikely that a false claim would meet all 4. It's about minimizing the chance of being tricked, basically.
So it's not about eliminating doubt. It's about making a claim much more believable than it would otherwise be. Okay, this is making me think. What about explanatory arguments? I'm intrigued by this idea of finding the best explanation for something.
This is where I think they get really interesting. So one really famous example is the minimal facts approach to the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay.
And this approach starts with 4 facts that are pretty widely accepted by scholars, even the skeptical ones. Fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2, his disciples believed they saw him resurrected. Fact number 3, these disciples went from being terrified and in hiding to boldly proclaiming this resurrection. And fact number 4, even Paul, who had been persecuting early Christians, he became a believer after having, some kind of similar experience.
Okay, I could see how those would be hard to argue with. But how do we get from those facts to the conclusion that Jesus actually rose from the dead? What about other possible explanations?
Well, that's the heart of this argument. Proponents of this argument, they examine all the different possible explanations.
Okay.
So things like hallucinations, or maybe the story was just made up. And then they argue that none of these explanations are as convincing as the actual resurrection itself.
That's a pretty bold claim. What about the argument that there's no real agreement among scholars about what the disciples actually experienced? Some scholars say that maybe the stories were exaggerated or even invented later on.
You've hit a major point of contention there, because if there's no agreement on even those basic minimal facts, then the whole argument becomes a lot weaker.
Yeah.
It becomes a debate about how much we can trust the sources themselves.
So it comes down to how reliable we think the historical accounts are.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, let's tackle the last category then. Probabilistic arguments. I have to admit, the idea of math makes me a little nervous, but I'm sure you can break this down for us.
Don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay, good.
Probabilistic arguments are all about how the evidence impacts the likelihood of something being true. Think of it like this. Imagine you're building a legal case.
Okay.
Each piece of credible evidence that you bring in makes your conclusion a little bit more likely to be true.
Okay, yeah.
It's about building up a case.
So it's not about proof, it's about making it more and more likely as the evidence, stacks up. So how does this apply to arguments for miracles?
Well, a great example comes from the philosopher Bishop Butler, and he said that if a bunch of events can't be explained by chance, they likely point to some specific cause.
Okay.
The more pieces of the puzzle that you can put together, the clearer the picture becomes. And multiple independent testimonies are really important here. If several people who aren't connected to each other, if they all tell the same story, it's a lot harder to dismiss it as just a coincidence or a lie.
Right, so it's like in a courtroom. The more witnesses you have who corroborate a story, the more believable it becomes. But I guess ultimately, a person's own beliefs play a role too, right? Like what they already believe will influence how convincing they find the evidence for a miracle.
Oh, absolutely. Our worldview, our assumptions, even our prior beliefs, they all color how we interpret the evidence.
Right,
What seems convincing to one person might not be convincing at all to someone else
right.
because they're coming at it from completely different perspectives. And that's one of the reasons why this whole debate about miracles is so complex and so often subjective.
This is mind-blowing. We've gone through all these different ways to argue for miracles, but what about the flip side? What about those who argue against the possibility of miracles altogether? What kind of logic and reasoning do they use?
Well, they've got their own set of arguments, and arguments against miracles can be general, like challenging the very concept of a miracle, or they can be specific, targeting the weaknesses in individual miracle claims.
So some are saying miracles just flat out can't happen, and others are saying prove it to me and then maybe we'll talk.
Exactly.
Okay, let's start with the arguments that miracles are impossible. What kind of approaches do they use?
Well, some arguments come from very specific theological viewpoints. For example, Spinoza, he basically equated God's will with the laws of nature. So if God's will is absolute and natural laws are like an expression of that will, then a miracle, which by definition violates natural law, becomes a contradiction.
So philosophers are playing a cosmic game of logic here. It seems to depend on the very specific view of God and the universe, though. Right.
You're exactly right. Now, Voltaire, he had a more straightforward argument. He said that immutable laws can't be broken. Therefore, miracles are logically impossible.
But couldn't you argue that maybe there are like higher laws that we don't understand yet? Laws that govern both the natural and the supernatural, so what we see as a violation is actually part of this larger, more complex order.
That's one way to counter Voltaire's argument. Another rebuttal comes from Paley, who said that miracles can be seen as God acting purposefully in the world. So it's not a violation of his creation, it's more like an intentional intervention.
So it's like saying God made the rules, but he can also bend them when he has a reason to.
Exactly.
Okay. What other arguments against the possibility of miracles are there?
Voltaire also presented a moral argument, and he said that a perfect God wouldn't need to fix creation with miracles, because that would suggest that there were flaws in the original design.
That's a bold statement. Wouldn't that depend on your theological assumptions about God's purpose and how he, interacts with the world?
Exactly. And as you can see, even arguments against miracles often rely on some pre-existing philosophical or theological beliefs.
Right. It's not as simple as it might seem at first glance. Okay, so we've looked at arguments that miracles are impossible, from a logical or theological standpoint. But what about those who say, okay, even if they did happen, we could never know for sure?
Right.
They seem to be attacking the very foundation of belief in miracles.
This is where the shadow of Hume really looms large. He argued that human testimony is just inherently unreliable, especially when it comes to extraordinary claims. He essentially said that we should always be more skeptical of the claim that a miracle happened than we are of the miracle itself.
That seems a bit extreme, doesn't it? I mean, we rely on testimony all the time.
Right.
Think about history books, eyewitness accounts in court, even just believing what our friends tell us. Is it really fair to just say, well, all testimony is unreliable?
That's a good point. And a contemporary of Hume, Whately, he pointed this out in a pretty funny way. He used an analogy. He said, okay, some books are trash, and Hume's work is a book, therefore Hume's work is trash. It's obviously flawed logic.
Yeah.
Just because some testimonies are unreliable doesn't mean they all are.
Right. That's a good way to, kind of poke a hole in that. So how have others, challenged Hume's argument? Because he's basically saying we should never believe anyone about miracles, right?
Well, they attack his basic assumptions. For instance, some argue that just because we don't have evidence for a miracle, that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
You can't assume something didn't occur just because you weren't there to see it.
Right. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. What are some other ways people have pushed back against Hume's skepticism?
Well, some argue that the improbability of the miracle itself needs to be weighed against the improbability of the testimony being false.
Okay.
If you've got multiple credible witnesses, the odds start to shift in favor of the miracle.
So it's like a balancing act. You put the evidence on each side and see which way the scale tips.
Exactly. And two of Hume's contemporaries, Price and Adams, they argued that the evidence for certain miracles, like the resurrection, is actually strong enough to outweigh that initial improbability.
So they're saying don't just dismiss miracles out of hand. Actually look at the specifics of each case.
Right. And in more recent times, the philosopher Hodgick actually did a very detailed breakdown of Hume's argument, and he pointed out a lot of logical flaws and inconsistencies. For instance, he argued that Hume's reliance on experience as the ultimate test of truth, that's just too limited.
Okay.
And it can lead to some pretty absurd conclusions.
So Hume, while influential, definitely has his fair share of critics.
Oh, yeah.
What impact did his work actually have on this whole debate about miracles, though?
Well, it was huge. His work had a huge impact on biblical scholarship, and it's still being debated today. His skepticism about miracles has really shaped how many scholars approach historical accounts of the supernatural. But on the other hand, it also sparked some very rigorous defenses of miracle, leading to, a deeper understanding of the evidence and the arguments involved.
This is so fascinating. We're really peeling back layers of history and philosophy here, and it reveals just how complex this whole debate about miracles really is. I'm ready to go even deeper.
Me too. Let's do it.
So let's shift gears a bit and consider this. What if we actually accept that a miracle has happened?
Hmm.
What are the implications then? What can we conclude from that?
That's where things get even trickier. Because even if we say, okay, a miracle has occurred, we still have two big questions to answer. What caused it, and does it actually prove that God exists?
Okay, so even if we're on board with the miracle itself, there's still room for debate about where it came from and what it means. It's like saying, okay, something amazing happened, but who or what was behind it?
Exactly. So the first issue is, can beings other than God perform miracles?
Okay?
This has been a huge topic of discussion for theologians and philosophers for centuries. Some argue that lesser spirits or other supernatural entities could be responsible for seemingly miraculous events, while others insist that miracles are exclusively the domain of God.
So we're back to the question of agency. If something beyond the natural world is at work, do we just automatically assume it's God, or could it be something else entirely?
Precisely. And this has big implications for the argument that uses miracles as proof of a specific God.
Right.
Because if other supernatural agents can do miracles, then their value as evidence for, let's say, the God of the Bible, that gets weakened.
Right. It's like saying, sure, maybe something supernatural is going on, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the God that's described in this specific religious text.
Right.
Are there any other interesting views on this?
There's an even more radical view. So Chrysides, he argues that miracles can't be attributed to any agent at all, divine or otherwise.
Wait, so he's saying miracles are just random events with no intention behind them, or that they're not even really miracles at all. Help me understand this, because that seems pretty counterintuitive.
So to understand his point, we need to dive a little bit into this concept of agency and philosophy. And agency basically means the capacity to act with intention and purpose.
Okay.
Chrysides argues that if a being is truly free, then their actions are by definition unpredictable. So a miracle, as this break from the norm, it just doesn't fit with the idea of a free agent deliberately causing it. Now, it's a very complex argument, and even though it's thought-provoking, it's not a view that's widely accepted even among people who are skeptical of traditional theistic explanations.
Okay, so we've got a range of possibilities here. God, other supernatural beings, or no intentional agent at all. But for the sake of argument, let's say we're dealing with a miracle that really does point to some kind of divine intervention. Does that automatically prove God's existence?
Not so fast. There are philosophers who say that even if we accept that a miracle happened, it still doesn't give us enough proof for God.
Okay.
For instance, Overall presents a really interesting and counterintuitive argument. He claims that miracles might actually provide evidence against God's existence.
Hold on, how could a miracle possibly argue against God?
Right.
That seems completely backwards.
I know, it's a very interesting argument, but his argument basically rests on three main points. The first one is, he suggests that if we see order and harmony in the universe as evidence for God's design, then miracles, which kind of disrupt that order, they would actually count against God's existence.
So it's like finding a glitch in a perfectly designed system. It makes you question the designer's skill.
Exactly. His second point is that the constant debate and disagreement about whether miracles are real and what they mean, he says that actually hinders our understanding of the world.
Okay.
He's basically saying that if God truly wanted to reveal himself through miracles, wouldn't he make it a lot clearer? Wouldn't he make it more universally convincing?
That's a good point. Why make it so confusing and open to interpretation if your goal is to prove that you exist?
Exactly. And his third point is the classic problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does he only perform miracles occasionally and seemingly randomly? A truly benevolent God, the argument goes, would intervene much more consistently to stop suffering and injustice.
So he's not just focused on the miracle itself, he's looking at the bigger picture of God's actions and the state of the world. He's saying that if miracles are supposed to be this evidence for God, they actually raise more questions than they answer.
Exactly. Overall's arguments are challenging because they force us to think beyond the surface level of, oh, something miraculous happened, and consider what they mean for our whole understanding of God and the universe.
Right. And are there counter-arguments to these points?
Oh, of course. A lot of philosophers don't buy Overall's argument. They say that he kind of misrepresents how theists typically view God. Most believers don't see God as this micromanager who's constantly intervening. It's about different perspectives on how God interacts with the universe. And, the idea that miracles disrupt order, that can also be challenged. One could say that miracles, while they are extraordinary, they don't necessarily negate the overall order of the universe. Maybe there are these rare exceptions that actually highlight how consistent the natural laws are.
It's like the exception that proves the rule. The fact that miracles are so rare and noteworthy actually reinforces this idea that, the natural world operates according to these very predictable laws.
Exactly. And as for the argument that miracles hinder progress, you could also counter that by pointing out how, throughout history, debates about miracles have often led to intellectual curiosity and new discoveries.
So instead of, holding us back, miracles could actually be catalysts for deeper exploration and understanding. Man, this is so complex and nuanced. It seems like there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all approach to miracles.
You got it. That's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It requires us to really grapple with these really fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, and the possibility of something beyond the natural world.
We've covered so much ground already. We've talked about different definitions of miracles, arguments for and against their existence, and what it would mean if we accept them as real. Where do we go from here? What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that the debate about miracles, it's definitely not over.
Right,
There are really strong arguments on both sides, and at the end of the day, each person has to weigh the evidence and come to their own conclusions.
right. It's like we've given our listeners a toolkit, a set of tools for critical thinking so that they can, participate in this conversation with more nuance and depth.
Exactly. Another takeaway is that miracles aren't just this, abstract philosophical puzzle. They have real-world implications for how we view the world, our place in it, and our understanding of the divine, if we believe in that sort of thing.
It's not just about winning an argument. It's about wrestling with these really profound questions that have shaped human thought for centuries.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding. It allows us to explore the intersection of philosophy, theology, and history, really grappling with some of the most challenging and interesting questions that humanity has ever asked.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this vast and complex topic. There's so much more to explore.
There is, and that's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more questions to ask.
So where does this leave our listeners? What's the next step for those who want to, keep digging into this?
I'd encourage them to delve deeper into the arguments we discussed, explore the work of the philosophers we mentioned, and keep those conversations going with people who have different viewpoints.
It's all about staying curious, keeping that thirst for knowledge alive.
Exactly. And to leave you with a final provocative thought, we've been talking about whether miracles violate natural laws. But what if, instead of breaking those laws, they actually reveal even deeper laws that we hadn't discovered yet?
Okay.
Laws that govern how the natural and the supernatural, how the material and the spiritual interact with each other.
That's a really interesting idea. So instead of seeing miracles as these disruptions, these anomalies, we could see them as clues to a much more profound, interconnected reality.
Precisely. And that perspective, it challenges that traditional separation between science and religion, suggesting that they might not be as mutually exclusive as we often think.
So rather than this image of science and religion locked in this eternal battle, we can view them as complementary ways of exploring the same reality, just from different angles.
Exactly. It's a perspective that encourages wonder and humility. It acknowledges that we don't know everything and that our current understanding is limited.
This has been a fantastic deep dive, I have to say, full of twists and turns, mind-bending arguments. I feel like my brain has expanded tenfold.
Mine too.
It's been a privilege to explore this topic with you and our listeners, and I think we've given everyone a really valuable service by presenting these different perspectives in a way that's clear and engaging. Now everyone has the tools to approach this really complex issue with more nuance and to think more critically about it.
Absolutely. We've given them the framework to understand the historical and philosophical context for this whole debate, plus, the logic behind all these different arguments.
And we've encouraged them to think for themselves, weigh the evidence, and draw their own conclusions.
Exactly. After all, this question of miracles, it's a very personal one.
Right?
It's shaped by a person's beliefs, experiences, and interpretations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main message you hope people take away from it? What's that one thing you really hope they remember?
I think more than anything, I hope they remember to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind. The world is full of mysteries, and the more we learn, the more we realize just how much we don't know.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of miracles. Until next time, keep your mind open and your curiosity alive.
Yeah, and it really gets even trickier from here because even if we accept that a miracle did happen,
Right.
we still have a couple big questions.
Yeah.
What caused it?
Right.
And does it actually prove that God exists?
So even if we're like totally on board with the miracle itself,
Right.
there's still this whole other debate about where it came from and what it means.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, okay, something amazing happened, but who or what was behind the curtain?
Right, exactly. And so the first issue is, can beings other than God perform miracles?
Hmm.
This has been a big debate for theologians and philosophers going way back.
Yeah.
Some say that maybe it's like lesser spirits or other supernatural entities
Okay.
that are behind these seemingly miraculous events,
Right.
while others say no miracles are strictly God's territory.
So we're back to this whole question of agency.
Right.
If something beyond the natural world is at work, do we automatically jump to God? Or could it be something else entirely?
Exactly. And that has some pretty big implications when you're talking about arguments that use miracles as proof of a specific God.
Right.
Because if other supernatural things can do miracles, well, then the value of a miracle as evidence for, say, the God of the Bible gets a lot weaker.
Right. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe something supernatural is happening, but that doesn't automatically point to, the God that's described in this particular religious text.
Right, exactly.
Are there any other kind of interesting views on this?
There's one that's even more radical.
Okay.
Chris Sides, he argues that miracles can't be attributed to any agent at all,
Okay.
divine or otherwise.
So he's basically saying that miracles are either just totally random events with no intention behind them, or they're not really miracles at all.
Huh.
Help me understand this, because that seems a little counterintuitive.
It is, yeah. To understand Cressida's point, we got to dig into this idea of agency in philosophy.
Okay.
Agency basically means the ability to act with a purpose, with an intention.
Okay.
And so his argument is that if a being is truly free, their actions are unpredictable.
Okay.
So a miracle, as this breaks from the norm, it just doesn't line up with this idea of a free being choosing to make it happen.
Right.
It's a really complex argument.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, but it's not very popular even among people who are pretty skeptical of the traditional theistic explanations.
Okay, so we've got a range of possibilities here. God, other supernatural beings, or no intention at all.
Right.
But let's say, for argument's sake, that we're dealing with a miracle that does seem to point to some kind of divine intervention.
Okay.
Does that automatically prove God exists?
Not necessarily. Some
Okay.
philosophers say that even if you accept a miracle is real, it's still not enough to prove God.
Okay.
Overall, for instance, he actually argues that miracles might even be evidence against God's existence.
Hold on now. How could a miracle argue against God?
Right.
That seems totally backwards.
I know, it's a very interesting argument.
Okay.
It basically boils down to three main points.
Okay.
The first is that if we see order and harmony in the universe as evidence of God's design, then miracles, which kind of mess up that order,
Right.
would actually go against the idea that God exists.
So it's like you find a glitch in a system that's supposed to be perfect.
Exactly.
You start to question the designer.
Right. His second point is that the constant arguments and disagreements over whether miracles are real and what they mean
Yeah.
actually make it harder to understand the world.
Okay.
If God really wanted to show himself through miracles, he'd probably make it more obvious.
Right. Why make it so complicated and open to interpretation if you're trying to prove you exist?
Right. And his third point is the old problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all good, why does he only do miracles every now and then, and in seemingly random ways?
Right.
A truly good God, the argument goes, would intervene more often to stop all the suffering and injustice.
So he's looking not just at the miracle itself, but the bigger picture.
Right.
God's actions, the state of the world, and saying if miracles are supposed to be evidence for God, they actually raise more problems than they solve.
Exactly. Overall's argument is challenging because it pushes us to think beyond, oh, wow, something miraculous happened, and think about what it means for our whole understanding of God and the universe.
And are there counter-arguments to these points?
Oh, of course, a lot of philosophers aren't convinced by Overall's argument.
Okay.
They say that he kind of twists the way most theists actually think about God.
Right.
Most believers don't see God as this micromanager who's constantly stepping in to fix things.
Right.
It's about different perspectives on how God interacts with the world and, this idea that miracles disrupt order.
Right.
That can also be challenged. Someone could say that miracles, while they are amazing and unusual, they don't actually contradict the overall order of things.
Right.
Maybe there are these rare exceptions that actually highlight how consistent the laws of nature really are.
So it's like saying the exception proves the rule.
Right.
The fact that they're so rare makes them stand out and actually reinforces this idea that the natural world works in these very predictable ways.
Exactly. And as for the argument that miracles hinder progress, you could say that debates about miracles have actually led to a lot of curiosity and new discoveries throughout history.
So instead of holding us back, miracles could actually push us forward, to explore and understand things more deeply.
Exactly.
Man, this is so complicated.
It is.
There's so many different angles. It seems like there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all way to look at miracles.
You got it. And that's what makes it so interesting. It really forces us to think about these big questions. What is reality really? Like, what are the limits of our knowledge, and could there be something beyond the natural world?
We've covered so much ground already, different definitions, arguments for and against miracles, and what it would mean if they were real. So where do we go from here? What are some key takeaways for the listeners?
Well, I think one of the most important is that this debate about miracles, it's far from over.
Right.
There are strong arguments on both sides, and everyone has to weigh the editors and decide for themselves.
So it's like we've given everyone listening a toolkit for critical thinking so they can join the conversation with more nuance and depth.
Exactly. And another takeaway is that this whole miracle thing, it's not just some abstract philosophical debate.
Right.
It has real-world implications. It affects how we see the world, our place in it, and even our understanding of the divine, if you believe in that sort of thing.
Right. It's not just about winning an argument. It's about grappling with these really deep questions that have shaped how people think for centuries.
Exactly, and that's what makes these deep dives so worthwhile. It lets us explore where philosophy, theology, and history all meet and tackle some of the toughest and most fascinating questions humans have ever asked.
I couldn't agree more. It feels like we've only scratched the surface.
We have.
There's so much more to discover.
There is, and that's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn, more viewpoints to consider, more questions to ponder.
So where does this leave our listeners? What's the next step if they want to keep digging into this?
I'd say go deeper into the arguments we've talked about, look into the work of the philosophers we mentioned, and keep having those thoughtful conversations with people who see things differently.
So stay curious. Basically, keep that thirst for knowledge alive.
Exactly. And to leave you with one final thought-provoking idea, we've been focused on whether miracles violate the laws of nature, but what if instead of breaking those laws, they actually show us even deeper laws that we haven't figured out yet?
Okay.
Laws that govern how the natural and supernatural, the material and the spiritual all work together.
That's a really interesting concept. So instead of seeing miracles as these weird disruptions, we could think of them as clues to a much bigger and more interconnected reality.
Precisely. And it challenges that traditional divide between science and religion.
Right.
Maybe they're not as opposed to each other as we often think.
So instead of this picture of science and religion fighting forever, we can think of them as different ways of exploring the same reality, just from different perspectives.
Exactly. It's a viewpoint that inspires both wonder and humility, acknowledging how much we don't know and the limits of what we currently understand.
This has been an amazing deep dive, full of twists and turns and mind-blowing ideas. I feel like my brain has grown like 10 sizes.
Mine too.
It's been great exploring this with you and with our listeners, and I think we've done a real service by presenting all these different sides in a way that's clear and engaging.
I think so too.
Now everyone has the tools to approach this complex topic with more nuance and think more critically about it.
Absolutely. We've given them the historical and philosophical background for the whole debate, plus the logic behind the different arguments.
And we've encouraged them to think for themselves, look at the evidence, and reach their own conclusions.
Exactly. After all, the question of miracles, it's a personal one. Shaped by our individual beliefs, experiences, and how we interpret things.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you really hope people will remember about miracles?
I think the most important thing is to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, and stay open to new ideas. That the world is full of mysteries, and the more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know. And that's what makes this journey of discovery so exciting.
That's a perfect thought to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the world of miracles. Until next time, keep those minds open and stay curious. It really makes you think, what if instead of miracles breaking the rules, they're actually like hints about rules we just haven't figured out yet?
Right, like a whole other level of natural laws that govern how the supernatural stuff interacts with the world we see.
Right. It's a much more inclusive view than this whole science versus religion thing.
Yeah.
It's like saying maybe there's way more to the universe that we can measure or explain right now.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder to stay humble, you know?
Yeah.
We've learned a lot about the natural world, but there's still so much we just don't know.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. So many different angles on miracles, how to even define them, the logic behind the arguments for and against them, and even what it means if we say, okay, miracles are real.
It's a lot to take in.
I need a nap.
I know,
But
right?
it's been so fascinating to really go deep on this stuff.
It has. I love getting into the nitty-gritty of these complex topics.
And I think we've done a good job of explaining these complex ideas to our listeners,
I hope so.
in a way that's clear but still engaging. So now they've got a much better grasp of this whole miracle debate.
Right.
And they've got the tools to think critically about it.
Yeah, we've given them the background, the historical and philosophical context for the whole thing, plus we explained how the different arguments worked.
And most importantly, we encourage them to think for themselves.
Yes.
Weigh the evidence and come to their own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, whether you believe in miracles or not, it's a deeply personal decision.
Right? It's influenced by your own worldview, your experiences, and how you interpret the world.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this episode, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners will remember about miracles?
More than anything, I hope they'll keep exploring, keep questioning, and stay open to new possibilities. The more we learn about the universe, the more we realize how much we don't know. And that's what makes this journey of discovery so exciting.
That's a perfect thought to leave everyone with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into miracles. Until next time, keep your minds open and stay curious.